Welcome to the Church at the Margins seminar. As you all probably know, the Church at the Margins is an initiative and part of the God for All strategy of the Evangelism and Growth team. The strategy was approved at the conference of 2019, and wonderfully, despite the challenges of the pandemic, the conference decided in 2020 that it would maintain the same budget. And the church has been hugely generous in offering, enabling the Evangelism and Growth team to actually exist, and hugely generous in a piece of work called New Places for New People. And the whole point of New Places for New People is to enable new Christian communities in different spaces with new people. And there are 5 streams to this, of which Church at the Margins is one of the 5. So in this workshop this afternoon, and it's going to be a workshop, friends, I am going to put you to work. We're going to think about what does it mean to be a church at the margins. So here, friends, is the first task. I want you to take just a minute to think about margins and marginalization. And I just want you to do a word association. What are the words that come to mind when you hear the term people at the margins or marginalization? What kind of people? What kind of categories? Where are they? What does it mean? So just take, I'm going to time you 30 seconds to a minute to do that. If you've got a pen and a piece of paper, feel free to write it down, and then we'll share together when you've had a bit of a think. The people, Matt and Helen, have the advantage of being able to chat to each other, so that's even better. You two chat to each other. Okay, friends, clear about the task? 1 minute. Okay, friends, time up. Anything that you've thought of, feel free to unmute and let's just have a free-for-all. Margins, marginalization, what have you thought of?
Well, I just thought of not inclusive, or not accepted, not allowed to have a piece of the fruitcake.
Yeah. So being left out, excluded. Thank you, E. Yeah. Anyone else?
Not mainstream.
Not mainstream. Yeah.
Segregated.
Say that again, Miss Happy, sorry.
Segregated.
Segregated. Yeah, absolutely.
I thought of the edge. Oh, sorry, Helen.
No, you go on, Esther.
On the edge. Can you hear me?
Yeah. On the edge.
Yes. Mentally ill, impoverished, all of those.
Yeah. Matt and Helen?
Outcast.
Yeah.
Vagabonds.
Ooh, tell us about vagabonds, Matt.
I've just the reflection of a Stuart Townend song, which I love, is called Vagabonds. Come on, you vagabonds, come on, you don't belongs, winners and losers, come people like me. So that's what came to my head of vagabonds.
Yeah, I love that song. Come people like me.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. People like me, isn't it? Fabulous. Right, friends, let me just share my screen a moment to share with you some of the things I've been thinking about. So, as I said to you before, Church at the Margins, new Christian communities, and we've already decided amongst people who are economically vulnerable. And it's really interesting, isn't it? And I want to be really clear, right from the start that we really need to think about language, and no language is perfect for this. So some people have said, this is really about Church of the Poor, but labeling people poor is an interesting thing in itself, isn't it? Who decides who's poor? Who's are people, it depends on your circumstances, doesn't it? There can be absolute poverty where you literally are homeless on the street, but it's possible to be quite impoverished and living in the United Kingdom, obviously. So this is about people, new Christian communities at the margins, on the margins, of the margins, but this isn't as about us doing to people. We're not taking God to the margins because, and those of you who were in the session this morning when Elaine Heath was talking, she reminded us that God is present in our communities and we are joining in, waiting to discover God together. And marginalisation, you've all talked about this. We can be marginalised because of who we are, can't we? And there are some things that we can do nothing about. Our ethnicity, we can do nothing about our gender, our sexuality. Maybe we're marginalised because of physical impairment or mental illness, physical illness. We've decided that whilst all of those things exist and all have the capacity to marginalise, because economic poverty has such a devastating impact, so that if you are impoverished economically and marginalized because of who you are, then it's even more devastating. So we've decided to focus on an overriding factor. And it's really interesting when you think about the Bible. In the Bible, many people are marginalized because of their condition. So the Bible, as you know, some of you biblical scholars on this call, which is wonderful. The Bible is a complicated text written over 2,000 years, over many, many different cultures. And actually, in the biblical narrative, it was written at a time when women particularly were marginalized. If you were born a woman, you were marginalized. You lived in a patriarchal society. Marriage was not for love. When you married, you were the property of a man. So in the Bible, there are loads of examples of people who are marginalized. And what sustains marginalization are the processes. So an example would be patriarchy sustains the marginalization of women. Women can't do anything about, what gender you're born with. And I would want to add, I would resist the idea of binary forms of gender, but within the biblical tradition, very much women and children absolutely marginalized. So it's a condition and it's a process. In order for marginalization to occur, the systems of society have to enable that. And I think that's really important to think about. Right, I'm going to stop sharing again because I've got another question for you. So we've talked about marginalization, and Church at the Margins, just to reiterate, is about people at the economic margins. So you could be marginalized for another reason, but economic poverty is the focus of Church at the Margins because poverty has such a devastating impact on anyone who experiences it, and particularly children. In the session this morning, we were reminded about adverse childhood events. Poverty often in families passes on from one generation to another because people are unable to get beyond the devastating impact of what happened to them as children. And when people are having all kinds of challenges, and when we might label them as making poor choices, badly behaved, and we might say to people, I've heard people say, why are they like that? We should avoid asking why and ask a different question, in my opinion. Instead of saying, why are they like that? We should say, what has happened to you? Ask them, what has happened to you? Because often they've had a childhood that was just absolutely terrible. Now, I'm not saying that alone, people do have terrible childhoods and manage to transcend them, but that's often because there was the positive influences in their childhood were there. Might have been a loving grandparent, might have been a lovely person at church who enabled them to have a different experience. So Adverse childhood events are one thing, but if you also have no protective factors, no loving positive, and the research shows that if a child just has one loving adult in their life in childhood, that can transcend a multiplicity of negativity. Now what an invitation that is for the church, friends, isn't it? One loving adult. This is why we've got to do work with children and young people, and we've got to think about what does it mean to be church to families who are struggling. One adult could change a child's life. Fabulous to even know that. So my second question to you, when you think about poverty, economic poverty, and the pandemic, what have you heard, or what are you maybe noticing in your community or nationally about poverty in the pandemic? That's your 15 seconds rather, not minutes, I'm going to give you for this. 15 seconds. So what are you noticing about poverty? Have you heard any stories? Have you noticed who's struggling? Who is the World Health Organization have said the single most protective factor in the pandemic is wealth. The single most protective factor is wealth. Because if you had money, you could get out the way of many of the things that were happening. So I wonder what you've noticed, and I wonder if you have any stories to share or any reflections. Feel free to unmute and tell me, what have you noticed?
One of my churches. No, go on, Eve. No, you're fine.
Sorry, man.
Oh, Esther again. Oh, okay. Yeah, go on ahead, Esther.
Thank you. I think for me, what I noticed in my context, the demand for food banks and supplies, went up quite much. And when we collected food, the people that we felt might not needed, sometimes turned up, and we're quite happy to get some of the bags that we handed out, and the way and the speed that food went really not surprised me, made me realize that there's quite a lot of poverty out there. Go on, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. Food banks. Yeah, we'll come back to food poverty. Matt.
Yeah, mine was actually a food bank where one of my churches started a food bank working with a mutual aid group. And I've had some very deep conversations with people. The advantage of wearing a collar, and people open up and really speak, breaks your heart, really. I mean, at Christmas, one was a nurse who queuing for a food bank. That makes me angry. And then the other one was somebody who had quite a good job and is applying for jobs last year, hundreds of jobs, and nobody getting back. And what really opened my eyes was that 25 people could be applying for one Costa job.
Yeah.
And that was such an eye-opener, really. So having really conversations, people really wanting to open up to people at the food bank.
I think what we noticed was obviously people who were already in debt that escalated. We normally run a session where people in debt can come for counseling and probably advice in terms of how they can manage, and the numbers just shot up so abysmally. So people who were already, as we would call, marginalized, went into deeper debts, and it's just so heart-wrenching when you hear some of the stories in terms of how they were kind of hopeless in every situation. They just felt they couldn't cope. So definitely debt increased, and people didn't know how they were going to kind of manage that.
Yeah, absolutely. And JPIT have led a really excellent campaign about that, because it's billions of pounds worth of debt. And some of and there are people who've made money in the pandemic. There are people who are now more in debt. And there are people, a small group of wealthy people are even richer. And as you say, Eve, the inequalities it's demonstrated are quite shocking. Anyone else want to say anything?
Yes, please. My experience was mainly single parent households. The need for children, both for food and that social isolation in ethnic minority communities, the lack of facilities to join in schooling, the lack of food during the day, which they would have gotten if they had been at school. The unregistered asylum seekers and migrants were really struggling. So I got involved with a couple of projects, which is what exposed me to those communities.
Yes, thank you, Masape. It's been well documented that the people with no recourse to public funds have become the most absolute destitute in the pandemic. Let me just share with you the slide that I have on this. Here we go. So this, just to echo the things that you have all said, and Eve said this beautifully, that lockdown and COVID-19 have magnified the inequalities of our society. So they haven't created new ones, they've just, what already existed, the pre-existing inequalities have been surfaced, and particularly the poorer have become poorer, and the disproportionate impact on the Black community has really been noticed, and we really need to respond to that. And I was grateful for Masape mentioning that. Here are some of the statistics, which I think are just miserable. 14 million people in the UK live in relative poverty. It's about 68 million people in the UK who live in the UK currently. And I think we should be absolutely appalled by that statistic. And some of the things that are really noticeable are that more than half of people in poverty now live in a working family. And I think that's one of the most really salient points, because often people, we think there are a lot of myths about poverty. There are a lot of myths that, there's lazy people who are not really doing anything. But actually now, half of people are actually in a working family, but they don't have enough to manage on. It's noted that 2 million children live in families affected by severe poverty. Those children are at high risk of developing things that will affect them for the whole lifelong. And we really need to do something around this. It's been noticed the significant rise of people on universal credit, and that was partly as a result of the furlough scheme. That was partly as a result of many people just being laid off quickly, because obviously people on 0 hours contracts, people in the gig economy, they just lost their jobs. Unemployment was already high, and it's expected to rise further because as the furlough scheme comes to an end, we know that many companies are just going to fold. We know that we've seen the rise of mental ill health, and the rise of domestic abuse has taught us yet again that women are not safe in our society, because the rise of domestic abuse is largely perpetrated by men against women. And the lockdown has significantly increased the amount of calls to the NSPCC from children and from women. And I think that is heartbreaking. There's been a lot of conversation around digital poverty. And so, how on earth could you homeschool if 3 children needed to access homeschooling in 3 different classes, but you only had 1 device, or nobody had a device, you only had a mobile phone? Can you imagine trying to do a lesson on a mobile phone as a little child? But it's not just about digital poverty, the lack of, being able to access it, but also digital competence. So the whole thing, the way in which, our church, I'm part of a church that went on Zoom, but our church is very inclusive and very diverse and includes people experiencing poverty. And some of those people didn't want to Zoom from their houses. They were so embarrassed by how their houses looked and don't have the confidence to come on camera many people face to face. And I think we forget about that. The risk of evictions is now huge, because you'll know that the government protected people for a while. That's going to be taken away. What we knew before the pandemic was that in the last 10 years of austerity, the life expectancy gap between rich and poor has widened. Life expectancy is one of the highest level indicators of a gap between rich and poor. And the BMD, the British Medical Association, has said this is very significant and caused by austerity. They're saying that despite the fact of all the high deaths from COVID, the deaths from COVID won't impact on life expectancy the way austerity did, which I find really, really salient. And let's just think about a few more things. I want to just provoke you with this, but I feel like people on the call today are all very aware of this, and you're people who want to do something, but I think this is important to hear. Mr. Wesley, in a sermon many years ago, obviously, on Visiting the Sick, said this: "One great reason why the rich in general have so little sympathy for the poor is because they so seldom visit them. Hence it is that one part of the world does not know what the other suffers. Many of them do not know because they do not care to know. They keep out of the way of knowing it, and then plead their voluntary ignorance as an excuse for their hardness of heart." Friends, I feel on the call today, this is definitely not you, but I have always been challenged by this, and I am bothered by the cosmic gap between some people who attend our churches and the experience of people in their communities. And we need to do something about bridging that cosmic gap that exists. I was listening to Anthony Reddy the other day, and he was talking about God's preferential option to the poor and the biblical tradition that I know we would always say yes, amen, and hallelujah to. And he said he wondered if, whilst the Bible proclaimed God's preferential option to the poor, does the church actually proclaim God's preferential option to the middle class? And I thought, you know, when friends, do you ever hear something and go, oh crikey, because you kind of go in your heart, oh yes, that's probably true, isn't it? You don't want it to be true, but you think, yeah, that probably is true. And I think, friends, one of the invitations of Church at the Margins and the vision behind this is, what are the bridges that we can create between that cosmic gap that enables us to become a community together? So this isn't about us engaging the community. This is about becoming a community and building a bridge over that cosmic gap and saying, what does it mean to actually prioritize people who experience poverty, to actually walk over to the other side and to say, what is it that we can be alongside to support you to do? Because actually what we want is not to take people back over to the other side of what we think. We want to create churches in places where people are and where people who are experiencing poverty lead churches in ways that make sense to them. Not the middle class way, but ways that make sense to them. New Christian communities that are vibrant because it comes from the hearts of people who are in those communities. So what might it be like to experience poverty? I'm going to stop sharing again, and I want to ask you that. How does it feel to experience poverty? And it may be that you have personal experience of this. I know my childhood would fall into the adverse childhood experiences category, but it may be that yours didn't, but that you know what it's like from your community. So I just want you to think, poverty as an experience. What are the words that come to mind? What are the feelings? So this isn't about the consequences, but how might it feel, do you think, to live in economic poverty? Anybody want to chip in? Just do this don't overthink it, just do it off the top of your head.
I'll jump in. Maybe feeling ashamed, actually.
Yeah.
I think that's quite a big thing, to look around you and maybe even question yourself why your circumstances are such, and why, despite everything that you might do to try and change things, why it doesn't change. Maybe.
Yeah. And sometimes in church, particularly churches that have a theology of, you know, God's blessing, and what you have is part of God's blessing. If you lack, you might think not just the shame caused by other people, but feel, you know, why are you not blessed? What is it that you've done? What have your family done? So shame, that is a really, really important one. Because shame is such a destructive emotion. You know, we feel guilt for what we've done, but shame is about who we are. That's quite different, isn't it? Shamed because of who we are. Anything else, friends?
I think I'll share from my personal experience, you know, experiencing poverty. Funnily enough, when I was in Nigeria, I was born and I grew up in Nigeria. I didn't personally experience poverty because my dad made sure we had more than what we needed, more than, you know, we were more than okay. But I experienced poverty when I traveled from Nigeria to here. And the first years I came, you know, to stay here, we didn't have any access to public fund. We didn't have any, it was difficult because of our status then. And so it was heartbreaking, you know, for me and for the kids. It was a place of loneliness and a place of hopelessness because we didn't quite know when it was going to end, you know, how long we were going to be in this state of just being outcasts, really. And nobody cares, you know, the government didn't care whether you fed or not, you know, you have to sort it out yourself until, you know, everything else is ready. And so it was a difficult mountain to climb to get to, you know, where we could say that, yes, we were out of that state of poverty. And perhaps where the shame might have come in would be relating back to the people at home, you know, how the situation is here, where it was meant to be better here. And, you know, at somehow, but you were kind of not very willing to say to, you know, for me, I didn't, my family didn't quite know it then, how difficult it was here until we know we came out of it.
You told them that, yeah. Thank you for sharing that personal story, Esther. That was really good. Heartbreaking to hear, but thank you. Anyone else?
I remember my dad sharing a story when, I mean, I'm 35 now, but when I was a toddler and my dad losing his job and pushing me as a toddler to a food bank, things for like nappies and food. I didn't know obviously at the time, but yeah, my dad just shares that story about how he felt and being concerned and is he going to ever find a job, and yeah, sharing that story about pushing me to the food bank. I remember that quite often.
And how difficult, you know, and particularly in our culture, and dependent on, you know, the community you live in, and can be, you know, quite an affront to your masculinity, can't it? In communities where being the man, the provider, that can be really difficult. You know, one of the difficulties about food banks, apart from the fact that it feels Dickensian, doesn't it, to be given food away in the way that we're doing. I mean, they meet a great need, and I'm really thankful for them. But food banks were meant to be emergency provision. You know, they're not nutritionally set up to feed a family. If you're totally reliant on a food bank, most don't have fresh food and vegetables. They don't have very many high sources of protein because they don't have dairy, they don't have meat, because largely it's tin goods and non-perishables. So food banks were only ever meant to be an emergency response. So families that are having to rely on them often are nutritionally very impoverished because that was never the point. Some people are actually now very much trying to get behind food pantries, where the food pantry provides fresh fruit and vegetables, meat and dairy, and you pay a certain amount a week. You can have a certain number of items, and local firms contribute, so you can bulk order and provide in the community. And as well, you've got then the dignity of choice. Because one of the difficulties about a food bank is you just have to take what it has. And not every food bank actually ends up having the food products that are culturally appropriate. Or, you know, I don't know about you, when you were growing up, there was things I just wouldn't eat, you know, typical kid, you know. And can you imagine as a parent having to go to a food bank and the things you know your children like are just not there, and you haven't even got that choice as a carer to give your children what you know they enjoy. So there's, you know, there's something that is, it's great as church to respond to the need for food, but I feel we also need to do something about campaigning to say we want to end food banks. We want to end the structural injustice that means they're needed, that food insecurity is a thing. So friends, anybody else want to share anything? No,
Yeah,
oh yeah, please go.
Well, I mean, I have been very fortunate that I wouldn't say that I have really experienced it to feel unbearable. But I've had the opportunity to travel up and down the place I come from, which is Ghana. And when you actually travel to, especially the northern part of Ghana, and you really see so much poverty, it's like I said, you know, it's unbelievable. I mean, you know, especially you were talking about, you know, the children. You know, when you, in this country, when you give a child a sweet or even a biscuit, yeah, there's that smile on their faces, you know. And you know, we got up to the northern part of Ghana, we had biscuits and sweets, you know, and you give it to the child, and the child just stands there, you know, like, what is this, you know, because they've never ever known, you know, to be in that sort of situation where somebody is handling them sweet. And of course, it's so dry, very, very dry up in the northern part. And to actually see the women having to travel for miles and miles and miles just to really get water from you know, a pit, as I would call it. And we had the opportunity to be driven to one part where we actually saw these children and women actually, you know, scooping water from the ground, and the water is so dirty, and this is what they're going to be drinking and actually, you know, doing all their domestic chores with. And to me, that is, you know, unbelievable to actually see it. I mean, when we talk about it, it's not so devastating as to actually being there, being alongside these people and see their lifestyle, to realize what poverty really can do to one. So, you know, you come away and you feel there's so much that needs to be done, but obviously the resources are not there. But like you said, we're called as a church to really address these issues and not just talk about them and go away. You know, like James says, you look in the mirror and then you just turn and go away and forget. Something needs to be substantially done about.
We need our hearts changing, don't we? Let me just share the screen with you again, friends. I've been doing quite a lot of listening exercises, and so with a group of people experiencing poverty, they talked to me about what it was like to experience poverty. And they didn't use the word survival, but this is the word that I used after talking with them. So they talked about many of the things that you've already talked about, the stigma and the shame, the fear of not knowing what was going to happen, the real challenge of the lack of choice. So one woman in particular talked to me about the fact that her universal credit was unpredictable. And if it was unpredictable by £10, then that was devastation. She had to make choices. Did she not pay the electric bill, or was it about food? So did she try and survive without electricity? Because, you know, on the pay meter, she could make a choice. What would she do? And what a terrible position for a woman to be in, and a woman trying to nurture her family. She talked about, many people talked about not being able to plan, the constant anxiety, the depression, the isolation, and the sheer sense of fear. And it gave for me this picture of just a daily act of survival, being in survival mode. And you know, friends, when, I don't know if you've ever, you know, been in survival mode for another reason, but often when you're trying to survive something, the anxiety within you is palpable. You have that kind of fight, flight, freeze kind of things. And I really felt that we need to somehow be people who really are willing to understand people's stories. We really need to get to know people, to understand what their lives are like. And one of the best things we can do is to genuinely befriend people. So here is just to take you through a few slides of the theological foundations for Church at the Margins. Friends, I don't think any of this will be a surprise to you good people on this call. So the first one is God's preferential option to the poor, that I believe is absolutely vital. And then the good news of Christ. I genuinely believe that to abandon the poor is to abandon the central theme of the liberating, life-giving message of the gospel for us all. When Jesus talked about, you know, he had come, you know, the Spirit was poured out upon him to be good news to the poor, freedom to the people who were held captive. Poverty holds people captive. The theological foundations for Church at the Margins are built on evangelism and social justice being deeply intertwined. You see, some people, some churches are great at social justice. They're great at food banks and doing things that respond to justice, and then maybe not so good at evangelism. And I don't think these two things are opposites to each other. I believe evangelism and social justice are deeply intertwined and must intersect. So I think that we can often have a very activist response and forget that the good news of the gospel is about changing lives. It's about being able to speak to people of the good news. Interdependence, it's really easy if we distance ourselves. You know, as Wesley said earlier, and I think it's still true now, it's easier to distance yourself if you don't know anyone. So we need to change how we are in our communities. We need to befriend people and become communities together. I believe that poverty is actually contradicts the will of God, and therefore we must respond to God's invitation. And these are some of the values of the Church at the Margins. So, you know, the first one is about justice. I think that we focused for a lot of years in the church on God being loving. And we focused on that aspect of God as if the love of God is somehow disassociated from the justice of God. But I think justice and love have to be deeply intertwined. And therefore, to be people who seek justice must mean that we're committed to listening to, amplifying, and being changed by the voices of people at the margins. So one of the things we might like to think about is, what does that mean in our communities? What does it mean to listen, to learn? You see, if we're going to resist being the saviors and the heroes and the rescuers and the fix-it, people who arrogantly think we know what other people should be doing, which I think is not helpful, we need to do this differently. We need to listen. So to prioritize the lived experience of people at the economic margins, we're not taking God to the margins when we're saying that God is present and we're looking for God to be revealed there. And so this is not finding solutions to other people's problems. Lived experience is crucial because people experiencing poverty are the experts. If the single women who were on universal credit had actually been consulted and allowed to develop the system that would best help them, the universal credit system, the benefit system would be very different to what it is now. Because those women, they know what would keep them safe. And we arrogantly instead impose things upon people. So one of the values of Church at the Margins is that this is about co-designing, co-creating, co-delivering. Sharing power. It's recognizing that power is ambiguous, but that actually we must resist the idea that we are doing things to people. We must recognize the dynamics of power and its potential misuse. It's about sharing. It's about inclusion. It's about participation. It's not the rich doing something for the poor. It's that willingness to be changed. And to enable leadership communities. Nobody needs us to rescue them. People can find solutions themselves. So what we need is the ability to support developing local leaders, people who are in that context, in that culture, and who are best placed to lead these communities. So here are 4, I think, key practices. First one, stop. Resist needs meeting. Resist provider models of caring. Stop believing we know the answers to other people's needs. You need to look, to be really attentive, find out what other people and local organisations are doing to challenge injustice and join in. One of the best things we could do in our church communities who are distant from people experiencing economic poverty is to say to them, go and volunteer for a day, go and experience and be alongside people who are experiencing poverty. Go and see, go and be prepared to look, be prepared to listen, connect with people in a way that they can share their stories. You know, we very rarely think ourselves into a new way of acting. We're much more likely to act ourselves into a new way of thinking. Experiencing things changes us. And to learn. Tolstoy said, everyone wants to change the world. No one wants to change themselves. I'm absolutely persuaded, friends, that if we want a different church, we have to do things differently. Yeah? It's not rocket science, is it? Doing the same thing isn't going to produce different results. Church at the Margins is an invitation to do things differently. And as a response to the pandemic, I think that's crucial. Let's not go back to doing what we know doesn't work. Let's move into something that has the opportunity for transformation. Might do a new thing, might not work immediately, but let's be less risk averse. Let's not worry if it doesn't work the first time. Let's not call it a failure. Let's call it learning. You know, nothing was invented by the people who said it can't be done. Things are invented by the men and women who have a go and try, see it doesn't work, and then try again. Nothing is invented by people who say it can't be done. Nothing is changed by the people who keep doing the same things and expect different results. We need to do things differently. So my invitation to you as we come to the end of our conversation, taking a step, one small step. What next step might God be inviting you to take? And as you think about this session today, what has it provoked in you? What has it provoked in you as a Christian leader, as a person in your community? What's the one thing that you might be able to do? Just take a minute to think about that, and then let's share together. One more step. What next step is God inviting you to take? Friends, let's just share. And this can be anything off the top of your head. It might be something personal. It might be something as leaders in the church and in your communities that you think, maybe we could do that. Maybe I could invite other people to that. What sort of things have you reflected upon?
think for me, it's about the food bank that we've got, where it's mutual aid, but sometimes I see it as the food bank and the church. And you said it wonderfully earlier on, where with evangelism, and yeah, I go, but on one side you've got the food bank who are doing a wonderful job getting on with it, and then you've got some of the church members who maybe go, oh, they've left the light on, or they've done this, and then dealing with that. And it's how can I, along with the church community, get the church and the food bank working together, so that the church aren't just saying, oh, that's the food bank, or the food bank is saying that's the church, but how for the sake of the community, how can we work together? And I think that's something I've been reflecting on for a few weeks. I mean, for example, the church are doing packed lunches, and I was hoping that the food bank would help with this, and not so much really. It's the church who've been left to do it. So it can feel like a bit of a us and them, and it's how come, the church and the food bank work more together.
And it's back to what Elaine Heath this morning was talking about. Instead of evangelism, she used she changed the word. She said, let's talk about neighborliness. What do we mean about being the good neighbor? And that sense in which, how instead of having two communities, do we become a community together, where friendships are made, where people can actually talk to one another? And I think that, food banks respond to need, and that's fabulous. But how could they be extended, perhaps, and at the very least offer a way in which people could have a coffee with each other? We could get to know each other, because if you come in, and sometimes food banks are stigmatizing in themselves using them. I was talking to a rural food bank the other day who deliberately have donated carrier bags from supermarkets, because people they were using all the same food bags to carry around their community. So people knew they'd been at the food bank, and that caused them even more shame. And that small thing, that hearing that and doing something about it, is a way of demonstrating, the good news, that you don't have to feel shame. But thank you, Matt. And anyone else want to comment on anything, any ways they've seen food banks work in a way that enabled a community to emerge, instead of a kind of, people coming and very much a giver and provider kind of model?
I think with us, it's more, a problem in terms of getting people who would volunteer, to basically help. Because we started the food bank, I think, about 2 years ago, and even to try and get, people to just come for just an hour or so was a problem, because obviously you have to have somebody there when they deliver, for you to actually, put the food in places and put them in bags, and then on the day be there. And before COVID, what we had done was, obviously they just don't come and collect the food, but you sort of have some way of sitting down and having a cup of tea with them, and talking with them. That's a way of fellowship as well. And our problem is really getting people to be committed, to really have constant people there for all those times that you need people to be there. So yes, and we thought that might bring, even people within the community who might even want to come and help. And that's a way of actually, letting them into the church. And as I said, the only problem we have, as good as food banks is just getting people to be there and be committed somehow, because most people are working, and they might not have that Thursday afternoon, which is your day for delivering the food, to avail themselves. But we're not giving up. We keep on. And what we're trying to do, because it's a circuit, and I think 4 out of the 7 churches provide food banks. So we try to work together as a circuit. So if one church is short of members to help, another church could actually help, which is, it's brought us out out of the wood. But it is difficult to get people to commit themselves.
Yes, I really appreciate that challenge. And if you have people struggling to do the mechanics of the food bank, actually having people to be a consistent presence to befriend people, because, you know, one way of befriending is by the same consistent presence. So if Helen's at the food bank every week, and I know if I go, Helen's going to come, and I could say, Helen, my name's Eunice, and I'm this and that. I'll feel much better if I see Helen's smiling face than 10 different people that I always have to, and I might be able to explain to Helen, you know, I've got 2 children, they like this, and she can help me, or she might think, oh, you know, Eunice is coming with the 2 kids, they like this. That's the first step to a human bond, instead of a user of a food bank who meets a different person every time, has to, and that probably doesn't explain. They say, you know, that there are many people who go to a food bank and never actually go over the doorstep. They're so ashamed that they'd rather starve. They'd rather stay hungry. And I just think, goodness me. But we need to, once, you see, the advantage we have is once Helen knows Eunice, and if I explain to Helen, why is Eunice in this need, then maybe Helen can help the church think through, well, this is Eunice's need. Are other people in the community, do they have the same kind of needs? What then might we respond with? But we're never going to know, and we'll always risk doing too if we don't have those relationships. You all know this, but it's something that I think we need to think about. How do our church communities going to help understand how to respond well, and not in a way that's actually, you know, very much doing to and powerfully providing for, rather than befriending and being a good neighbour where there's a mutuality. Anyone else, anything that's hit them, or anything at all of feeding back on the session, of a thing that might be just a takeaway, a thing that you might want to think about a bit more, because this has been just a very gentle introduction to some of the themes of Church at the Margins. I hope that you'll...
I think it's just hitting me that the church, we haven't really paid attention to the people that we are, you know, in parentheses, helping. We are just there, and you know, we just provide the help, and you know, maybe feel good about it, that yes, we are the church, we've done our Christian duty, we have provided food for these people, off you go. We haven't really made that space for them to come and tell us their stories, you know, and giving them the chance for us to know them and them to know us. They still know us as the people that just give them food. And maybe not as people that care enough to know about their welfare, you know, really know about their emotional needs and every other thing. And so that relationship, there's still that barrier that we need to possibly break down. Maybe invite them into our space, you know, in church, come in, or go into their space, you know, what are you doing? Let's be here for you. Let's do this with you, you know, today or the next day. Perhaps for us to maybe experience what it feels like. You might feel like not to have enough. Maybe set a challenge for our members, you know, for this week. Can you spend £20, £30 on a week, you know, and then come in and tell us how you felt. Maybe, you know, I don't know, or here's a bag for you. This is what you and your family would use for this week. Use it and then come back to us and let us know how you feel. So maybe then we would begin to see them differently.
Absolutely, Esther. Thank you for sharing that. It's really interesting. You know, when people started giving food parcels, can you imagine me setting up you a food parcel for the rest of the week and you just having to cope with what I give you? You know, that you know, one of the most fun things in my day is choosing what I have to eat. And some days I'll go, oh, I'll have this, I'll have that. And then when I get to it, I think, do you know what? I don't want that. I fancy this. Imagine that I impose my choices on you. And what if you open the bag and you think, I don't like any of these things? You know, most of us don't know how that feels. And yet we thought that was a good thing to do to people. And often we gave people things that, you know, they didn't like, that families didn't like. And I feel really challenged by that. You know, I really want to hear how that feels. Friends, thank you so much. We're slightly over the time, Martha, aren't we? Thank you for generously joining in. It's been really lovely to see you all. And if in your church families and communities I can be of any help, if you want me to come along and do a little a conversation, share about Church at the Margins, and I will be really willing to do that. You just drop me an email. I'm at attwoode@methodistchurch.org.uk. I can be contacted through the Evangelism and Growth Team pages. There's a whole load of resources on our website, including a very excellent webinar that we had on Tuesday night called Life on the Breadline. It's a research project that's been led by Professor Chris Shanahan. It's absolutely brilliant. And he's put all the resources on the website, the Life on the Breadline website, free. It includes really, really good academics. Professor Robert Beckford's on, Professor Anthony Reddy. It's great stuff. And one of the best things they do is they've surfaced an anti-poverty charter. And I really think that could be useful in the church communities. So please do go on there if you get a minute. But thank you very much for joining me today. And thank you to Martha.